So the history that we're talking about here is a progression of company. It's a railroad that started as several private lumber companies. The earliest lumber company that is of note is Brown Williamson and Company. It was founded in 1862 on Corralitos Creek. That company did quite well on Corralitos Creek, but it was still early days, so the technology was still kind of developing. So in 1868, the company expanded. It was originally just John Brown Williamson, that lovely creative name, and a couple of his minor associates. So in 1868, he added James Halstead, Lucius and Alvin Sanborn, and Charles Ford, the later founder of Ford's department store. And so things continued well, but what ended up happening was the company quickly realized that the timber that they had on Corralitos Creek would not keep the company afloat for the 10 years they had been hoping, and they really needed to find a new outlet. And so their solution was to start looking along Aptos Creek. So the first step was in 1877, they founded the Watsonville Mill and Lumber Company. So it was a much larger business with more financial backers, and it was based on Eureka Canyon in Corralitos Creek, and they used this to expand their operations and get some good capital. But lumber companies at this time, they were really run on shoestring budgets, and they just kind of went from one thing to the next. And so they already knew, as soon as they started Eureka Canyon, they knew they wouldn't be able to work there for very long. And yeah, so by 1881, they were running out of timber to log. So this is where the story gets quite interesting. So first, here's a photo, or maps. These are from Powell. All of the maps that are included on this are ones that Ron Powell did himself. And it shows the thing that we call today Rancho Soquel Augmentation. It still shows up on maps because it's a Spanish rancho. It was subdivided a different way than the rest of the un-rancho land was in the county, non-rancho land. But the augmentation was unique. You can see at the bottom left corner there, by the time the county was finalized and the San Mateo boundary was formed and moved, Soquel Augmentation was about 10% of the total land in Santa Cruz County. You can see right down at the bottom, there's Rancho Soquel, that teeny little thing. It's pretty much modern day Capitola. It's tiny. The augmentation was added originally to Martina Castro's grant because her brother, Rafael Castro, who owned Rancho Aptos, kept letting his cattle roam into her property. And she was getting tired of it, so petitioned for more land. And they very ambiguously just gave her pretty much everything north of her. And so you get this massive territory called the augmentation, which was augmenting her original rancho. And so Aptos is just, it's about a third of the total augmentation. You can see that. And about half of Aptos's watershed is Valencia Creeks. So on the right side here, you can see the relevant parts to our talk. And the most relevant for this specific talk are going to be tracks 8, which you can see here. It runs on left, on the west side of Aptos Creek. And then track 9, which is massive, which is this big chunk up here. So track 9 was owned by Carmel Fallon, who was Martina Castro's daughter. And she was married at one point to Thomas Fallon, which is where she gets her last name. It encompassed 6,845 acres of undeveloped timberland all over Aptos Creek. It encompassed most of the valley. It also had about 400 million board feet of lumber. And a board foot is lumber that's measured a foot by, shoot, I'm missing the last measurement. I believe it's a foot. I think it's just a cubic foot. And so it's massive amounts of lumber. And so in June 1881, Alvin Sanborn and John Brown of the Watsonville Mill and Lumber Company negotiated stumpage rights for it. Stumpage rights just means you don't own the land, you own the right to get the logs off the land, or the timber off of the land. And so once the timber's gone, the property reverts to the original owner. And the thing is, it was such a big operation that they had to partner with another big firm, which was the William Doherty of the Santa Clara Valley Mill and Lumber Company. That big firm owned property all over Zayante Creek and also in Los Gatos Creek. And so they were a huge firm. They pretty much dominated the Boulder Creek scene in later years, the Boulder Creek logging scene. So they're this large company, but this time they are mostly focused on Zayante Creek, but William Doherty felt like he could make a little bit of extra money, so he put some investments into this. And then also there's John Porter, who was one of kind of the co-founders of modern day Watsonville. He wasn't the namesake or anything, but he really was one of the early luminaries of the town. He helped co-found the Bank of Watsonville, and so he used those connections to help fund the purchase of the property. The final purchase of the property was in January 1883, which is when they decided they didn't just want the stumpage rights, they wanted everything. So they just bought out all of Carmel Fallon's property and owned it outright. And that will have a big effect later on. In fact, it doesn't fit into the story, so I'll just add, that has a huge effect later on because that meant that a huge portion of what became the Forest of Nicene Marks was just one big property owned by one firm. So it made it really easy to purchase that later on when it went to the state. All right, and just a couple, because this talk isn't supposed to really be about the Loma Prieta Lumber Company, I will mention the Loma Prieta Lumber Company was founded as a subsidiary in November 1883 by the Watsonville Lumber Company's management, and it had all of the same people involved, as well as a couple people such as A.C. Bassett and N.T. Smith, who are of the Southern Pacific Railroad, so they'll come in later. Thomas Bishop, who I believe was the lawyer to the Southern Pacific Railroad, and a man named J.A. Linscott, who was just kind of an investor, and he dropped out soon after. And by 1885, the Loma Prieta Lumber Company was largely autonomous of its parent company, and so that ended up being rather important later on when the Watsonville Mill and Lumber Company couldn't really exist anymore, so it more or less disappeared under its subsidiary. So we have this grand plan. We want to build a railroad to get this lumber out. The Watsonville Mill and Lumber Company, they have a ton of resources set to this. They brought in Southern Pacific help, and so in exchange for some management, or for some stake in the company, they founded on July 10th, 1882, the Loma Prieta Railroad, which was a wholly owned subsidiary of the Pacific Improvement Company, which was a wholly owned subsidiary of the Southern Pacific Railroad. So construction began April 1883, and they were building 5 miles north of Aptos, along what today is the Aptos Fire Road and the entry road into the Forest of Nicene Marks. The track was standard gauged in November 1883, so it was built using narrow gauge tracks, but with the intent to standard gauge before it actually operated. So I think that sometimes causes some confusion. And just to get a couple bureaucratic things, on June 3rd, 1884, it was consolidated with the Santa Cruz Railroad to become the Loma Prieta branch of the Pajaro and Santa Cruz Railroad. It was later merged into the Southern Pacific Railroad as the Loma Prieta Line and later branch in 1888 and 1892, respectively. But part of the appeal of this to Southern Pacific was actually competition. At this time, the South Pacific Coast Railroad had the route through the San Lorenzo Valley, so they had access to Big Trees, which is today's Henry Cow Redwood State Park. And the thing is, Southern Pacific wanted its own Big Trees, and it didn't really have any. So this gave them the opportunity to get their own Big Trees Park. But the problem is they're going to be harvesting all the lumber here. So it was going to be a limited option. So what they decided to do is make some basic rules that on the southern end of the track to 8s and 9, they would not cut the big old growth redwood trees that were directly beside the railroad tracks. And they were going to build a little hotel complex. And you get this kind of novelty of you get to see the big trees, but you also get to see a working logging operation because part of the lumber mill operation, because part of the appeal was you'd go up into the mountains and you could maybe visit it. Because this line also did allow passenger service. It wasn't scheduled passenger service, but specials and whatnot could go up there, and the work crews would use it. So there's this big appeal of let's go up into the mountains and see redwoods. Because people elsewhere, especially from the East Coast and stuff, they didn't see this. And so this was Southern Pacific's original goal. And so one of the things that they did was they tried to keep some of the areas not harvested right away. They knew they'd eventually get harvested, but they didn't want to do it right away. so this picture here, it's a little early, but it was more for advertising. But this is actually a rough depiction of an actual thing along the line, where there are 3 trestles that were lined up more or less in a row like this. And if you've been in the Forest of Nicene Marks, which I know most of you have been, and you've been to the base of the incline where the switchback starts to the top of China Ridge, if you look down Aptos Creek, this is an idealized version of what you actually would have seen in about 1888. Beautiful picture of railroad tracks just wrapping around the hills. So that just gives you an idea of kind of what the grandeur of this line would have looked like in its prime. All right, so we have a couple maps, but these ones are very important because these maps that Powell did, they show you every little nook and cranny of the railroad route. We won't go over all the details of it, but anyone who's gone into the Forest of Nicene Marks will have driven down the fire road or ridden their bikes down it. And so that fire road, you can even see he marked where the kiosk is. So he tried to show some highlights for what's there today. And so if you go up that road is the same exact route as the railroad until you get to the first bridge. And once you get to the first bridge across Aptos Creek, the railroad trestle would have been just the slightest bit to your right going into the park. And same thing at Mangles Gulch way down south. The bridge would have gone, or the trestle would have gone straight where the road kind of wraps around there. Once you're in the park, so that bridge, that first bridge over Aptos Creek is actually just about the boundary line when you're entering the Augmentation. Everything south of that was actually owned by Frederick Keene at the time, and so they had to get, the railroad had to get permission to use that for right-of-way. So everything north of that bridge, you're in the Augmentation. Things get a little messy on this map, so I won't go into too many details, but where you have the Porter House today, he marks it on the map here. It's within Tract 8. That little area there was the Porter House, and we'll go into a little bit more detail about what that house was later on. But this map only stops at the 3.7 marker. 3.7 miles is where the town of Loma Prieta is, which interestingly enough today isn't really marked on anything. So while they have signs for the Porter House and they have signs for the mill site, which was the later mill site was down here, there's actually nothing really marking when you're going right through the middle of the old town. And you do go through the town on your walk through the park. If you're going to the incline, you'll actually walk right through where the town was and you won't even know it. Following that trail, anybody who's gone on the walk to the incline will know that there's a couple cuts. Next time you're in there, if you haven't noticed them, look for them. Cuts are usually pretty obvious. At least one side of the trail will have a pretty shaved off wall. Those were done by the railroad. And then you get to the bottom of the incline, and that's where that impressive series of bridges are. So there's 2 bridges right at the bottom of the incline. Then they curve across. If you've continued ever on the Aptos Creek Trail, you can't really take bikes on there. But if you've continued across the Aptos Creek Trail, you will go through several cuts right away. And those were also done for the railroad. And then you get this weird long diversion where there used to be a bridge, and now you have to kind of bushwhack across the creek. And then this is an approximate location, but this red spot here is more or less where the earthquake sign is today. So that gets you a good idea. Just beyond the earthquake sign is where the track actually will diverge later, and so that will be the next topic. Building the line was, when they first built the line, they used 14 prefabricated bridges. They were built in Oakland and then assembled on site. 200 Chinese workers did all the grading and track laying. So several of these would have been workers that had just worked recently on the Santa Cruz Railroad, while other ones would have been working for other Southern Pacific projects in the area. Watsonville Mill and Lumber Company, their main contribution to the railroad's construction was they provided all the timber material for free and did at least some of the cutting for it. It's unclear exactly how that relationship worked. First 3 miles followed Aptos Creek Fire Road as it goes today, and then the next 2 miles, or that next mile and a half, follows the Loma Prieta Grade Trail, and then once it crosses back over, right now you have to go over the creek itself, but back then it would have a trestle, and then it matches back up with the Aptos Creek Fire Road once again for a little bit longer. But this shows you the back lot of Aptos Station. where you will see the tracks crossing. At this point in time, the tracks to the Valencia mill are long gone, but there's still remnants of them, which is those ones at the bottom left corner that go to the apple barns, the ones that were just moved, I believe, in Aptos. And then where that flat car is sitting on, right there, that flat car is the Loma Prieta branch. And there was a Y at the bottom. I think I showed that on that previous map. You can see a little bit of a Y. Y is just where trains can turn around. There are no turntables on this railroad at all. And so the only way for trains to turn around would be using that Y, which is what we have in downtown Santa Cruz now. Here's some of the Chinese workers working on the line. And this is probably about 1884. And so the destination that they were making for, oh yeah, and here's a worker camp that's viewed from below one of the prefabricated trestles. You're already seeing a little bit of evidence of some earlier logging attempts probably, since the hillsides are kind of barren here, but also it's a steep canyon. Aptos Creek it is today, it was then, and so there's definitely some damage, some landslide natural damage. This is the only photo we have of the Betsy Jane that helped build the Santa Cruz Railroad line several years earlier. It also helped build the Loma Prieta branch. So this is a very, very early excursion train. It's not a very good quality photo, but you can see several women and men on top of the flat car. And this is the only photo of the Betsy Jane from this period doing the construction. And it's just very interesting. This photo would also be from the Aptos Museum. I forgot to cite it. It's very interesting, though, that they built it as a narrow gauge and then later standard gauged it. And this is one of the most curious photos ever. You can see a really good shot of one of these prefabricated bridges in the background. Nice open deck truss bridge. And there's this little trail in the front that's used from just a fallen tree. They've put some guide rails. I'm not 100% sure when this photo is, and I'm not even 100% sure where it's taken, but I have high certainty that it is from the Loma Prieta branch. There seems to be a building up on the top, but it's kind of a mystery where exactly it is, because you can see there's actually a railroad track going underneath this bridge, and that makes it very unique because there were no real situations like this elsewhere in the county, but there were a couple spots on the Loma Prieta branch where tracks did actually go under other tracks. And then this is going to be our friend for a little while. This locomotive, which is number 80, it's a Baldwin. It was built in 1884, and so it became one of the first operating locomotives on the Loma Prieta branch. It is a saddleback, which means its water tank is kept on top of the locomotive. And it's named number 80. It's Jupiter, which is a very uncreative name at this point in history because everything's pretty much named Jupiter. But you're going to see this locomotive in several more pictures. In this instance, it has a mixed train. It's hauling passengers as well as a whole 2 cars of split stuff, maybe more in the back. Split stuff is literally anything that can be split off of logs. They weren't just firewood, though. You get grape posts. In some cases, you could get railroad ties. Things like shingles and shakes, which were used to cover roofs. A whole huge amount of things, and they actually required some of the better quality wood for a lot of split stuff. So people think lumber is the most important end product of logging, but it's actually often split stuff. They made more money, well, volume-wise. They made way more split stuff, and they made more money overall from split stuff than just cut lumber. Powell did a little bit of investigating and found something really cool in his explorations. We have a single photograph, this one here, showing Molino Station in the early days. And you can see it's narrow or standard gauge tracks on both sides, but this is a very early photograph, and it's before the Loma Prieta mill was built just below Loma Prieta, where we now call it the mill site in Nicene Marks. So the question is, what was built there? We have some sketchy notes about a shingle or shake mill that was at the end of that spur to the right, but not much else. And so he did a lot of investigating before the 1982 floods, when a lot of the evidence was washed away. And some of this is speculative, but what he definitely determined is that wasn't just a spur to nowhere or to just a shingle and shake mill. It was a full, impressive railroad system probably using the lifted rails that had been on the Santa Cruz branch, because that was standard gauge in 1884. And so what they probably did was took the rails, which are lower quality, and repurposed them for this railroad, what was the Molino Railroad. And further evidence for that is that the Hopkins family, Mark Hopkins was one of the big four who owned Southern Pacific. His wife purchased Track 8 around this time, and her and her son, Timothy Hopkins, owned Track 8, wanted to harvest it. This railroad's here. And so all the math works out. Track 8 was 1,167 acres, and it had a lot of timber on it. And so what seems to be the case is they built this very impressive railroad from Molino that then went south, and it was a narrow gauge railroad. It's unclear if it ran using horsepower, mule power, or small locomotives. That's just something we don't know. We don't have enough evidence for it, but at least according to Powell's research, he found plenty of on-the-ground evidence of rights-of-way that went all the way right to the Augmentation southern boundary, which would be the southern boundary of Tract 8. And it was just a wild ride, just crazy crisscrossing. It crossed Aptos Creek about a dozen times. There were switchbacks, there were little spurs up gullies and gulches. It was just a crazy little mess. And he claims that there's another photo that I haven't been able to see. So this photo showing just Molino, and you can see a little trace of some buildings off in the distance. That seems to be all the actual visual evidence we have for this. And since a lot of it was damaged, even a lot of that evidence is now gone. But when you go to, say, the Porter Picnic area or the Mary Easton Picnic area and go down to the creek, look around, you may find some evidence. There would be evidence of old, really crudely built trestles, probably. And just look for cuts. They still would have had to do some cutting in this area. And so it's a very interesting, still kind of mysterious part of the Loma Prieta branch, which it was privately owned and privately operated on behalf of one of the Southern Pacific's largest individuals. And it was also probably built by Chinese laborers. So it fits into the story in an interesting way because people don't really talk about it otherwise. And it will have a different importance a little bit later on. It seems these operations may have continued all the way to 1897, but I can't really say much more about them because we just don't have any progression of time for it. We don't know when exactly all of the operations, like when the track was extended or anything, or if it was built all at once or just kind of extended piece by piece. Back to the main Loma Prieta branch, where their destination was a place that they called Monte Vista. It was at the 5-mile marker just before a section that would later get the kind of terrifying name, Hell's Gate. And the Monte Vista mill, the railroad finished there in March 1884, and it ran for less than a year. During that little time that they had it there, you can see they quickly realized that they couldn't actually get their logs to the mill pond. So they had to build this really kind of serpentine switchback thing to get up to the top of the mill pond where they could actually dump the logs. And so that was not very helpful. The mill pond was also relatively shallow and long because the canyon's really narrow there. And so it wasn't really actually doing that well. So when it burned down on May 13th, 1885, I think everyone was kind of happy. I think it was just a sigh of relief, like, okay, we can rethink this and now we have a little bit of time. Now, it wasn't great because at this time, Frederick Keene's Valencia mill was actually supplying most of the lumber for the Loma Prieta Lumber Company at this time. And the Monte Vista mill's opening finally allowed them to make their own lumber, only for within a year, the mill burning down, and they hadn't even produced that much lumber for that year yet. So the Valencia mill started producing lumber once again for Loma Prieta Company for just a very short period of time until the Loma Prieta Lumber Company kind of got its act back together. So by July, they were able to do a little bit of operations back at Monte Vista, but they knew it wasn't going to be a long-term solution. So that mill eventually did shut down completely sometime in 1887, and that was pretty much the end of it. But the cool thing is we do have a lot of photos because it was still a lot of press at the time. So here's an early photo of the mill, possibly within a few months of it opening. You can see it has the Little Monte Vista station right in the front, which would have been the Loma Prieta office station, but also the railroad's office. You can see the larger mill in the back. You can see a couple tracks going in. It's really hard to see, but you can actually see just on the ridge running along the top, you can see a railroad grade. And so that would be going around the corner to the mill pond where it can deposit its logs. And here's a little close-up of it. You can see that 80, the Jupiter, once again, sitting in the yard. Those are worker cabins on the left side. And then you've got a lot of lumber that's ready to go. And again, you can see a little bit of that grade just above the Jupiter. This is a different angle. I think this is still the Jupiter. Yeah, it is. With a passenger car, you can see some of the workers' camps in the background, a boxcar. I don't know what's being delivered in the boxcar. And split stuff all over the right side. And I'm not sure what those are to the left side, but there's maybe shingle bolts. And then this is where things start getting interesting. So here's the Jupiter leaving through, there's the water tower and a little shack going through what would become the village of Loma Prieta. This is before Loma Prieta actually was a place. It was a stop on the railroad line from the beginning, but when it was a stop on the railroad line, it was literally the workers' camp. It started out as a Chinese workers' camp, and then it eventually became kind of a workers' camp just for anyone who was going there temporarily. The permanent workers would be staying in the cabins at Monte Vista. So this was more for temporary housing. And so in this one, you have a bunch of passengers, probably workers in this case. So before Loma Prieta burned down, though, there was one operation that they had to get the lumber, the timber. The timber was up on the hills, and so it's not easy to get that timber straight to the mill. So what they did was they built the first spur. And I actually discovered this spur before I even knew the whole history of this area, because when you go across in front of the incline, when you cut across to the Aptos Creek trail, and you go through that really really deep cut, right when you come out on the other side, if you look to your left, you'll see another cut. And what that is the beginning of the Loma Prieta Railroad's only actual freight spur that they built, from what I can tell, which was the Spring Creek spurs. This actually ended up being an actual stop on the railroad. It was registered and everything. And so it has a special status among all of the freight spurs that existed here. And it was a really kind of serpentine thing. A little bit of it creaked to the east, but most of it went through a switchback that then paralleled today's fire road that switchbacks up to the China Ridge, and then more switchbacks, and went almost all the way to Bridge Creek, where it had to stop because of the elevation difference. So very, very precarious road. This is up on the hill. It wouldn't have lasted for more than a couple years, but it allowed them to harvest a lot of it. Now, one interesting fact is Spring Creek is called that because it provided the spring for the water for the town of Loma Prieta, or the village. And so where you see that spur end, the tracks didn't really go any further north of it, or up the hillside from there, because they didn't want to pollute their water supply. So what happens? The mill burns down, they need a new home. So with the mill burning down, they relocated to Molino, which is where that shingle mill that I mentioned earlier was. But rather than just build directly off of that privately built spur, they built their own spur, and this really extensive complex, some of which survives. Again, I've mentioned the porterhouse, that site still survives, and the home survived for many, many years. The sawmill itself survived into the 1940s. The railroad grades throughout this area, some of them are still visible. And so just to give a quick summary of some of these things, construction of this mill began in the spring of 1886, shortly after the mill burned down, but they knew it would take a while for the whole complex to be built. The benefit of this area is the mill pond could be much deeper. It was still pretty much the same length, but it could be much deeper, which meant that the logs could float better without getting caught up on things underneath the water. There was also far more room for spurs that could be used to drop logs into the mill pond. So you can see here, there's multiple spurs, and there's even on the other side, this spur that's right next to the Trout Gulch Trail. that was actually used to haul using steam donkeys. They could haul logs into the other side of the pond. So they had many more places for spurs. They had places where they could do repair shops. They had places where they could park passenger trains and other rolling stock when it wasn't being used. They had tracks right in the town. They had tracks right across from, or a second spur right across from the bottom of the incline. So it was a very good area for a mill to be built. The mill itself was at the bottom of the mill pond, so you can see that big black blob down there. And then where Southern Pacific ended up building its little hotel didn't really work. So from what I'm going to admit, even Powell is very vague on this. So this is my own speculation. But what I suspect is that Southern Pacific built its hotel around late 1884 in the location indicated on this map. And we have a couple photos that show it in the distance. I think that was built before any of the milling material or machinery and infrastructure was built here. And then the mill burned down, the whole village moved south and settled where it eventually became the village of Loma Prieta. And that really just ruined the entire idea of this hotel complex, because the hotel seems to completely disappear from almost everything after 1887. So it seems the buildings survived, but the buildings were used probably more for guests of Loma Prieta and kind of more not for tourist purposes. And one final kind of thing that probably should be noted is as soon as this milling facility was done and all the spurs were installed, Southern Pacific sacked all of its Chinese workers. This was a common thing that happened at the time, but it especially was bad at this point. Anti-Chinese fever was all over America, and so Southern Pacific was under increasing pressure to get rid of their Chinese workers. They'd kept a staff of probably around 50 Chinese workers in a camp, which became the village of Loma Prieta. And so I'm guessing as soon as the last spurs were put in, they were kicked out and fired. And so after that, you don't really have any Chinese influence whatsoever on future construction projects in this area. So the village of Loma Prieta became really the heart of Loma Prieta, and it lasted throughout all of this period until about 1902, after which most of the logging operations had moved away, so the village no longer served a huge purpose. The directors, including not John Porter, but his son Warren Porter, who was the secretary, as well as the Bishop House, were held in a little compound. It had gardens. It had beautiful picket fence. It was very idyllic, looking over the upper end of the mill pond just across the bridge from the village. So it was a very nice little area. There's lots of good pictures of them. Here's some of the photos of the mill and the village. There's the actual mill itself. You can see some of the workers' cottages and things like the blacksmith shops, the cookhouse, and various other buildings kind of littered along the side. This would have been pretty early on in the construction, but you can already see how denuded the hills are next to the mill. There's a view of the mill from the railroad grade. So when you're walking on the Loma Prieta grade trail and looking to the right, this is pretty much what you would have seen back in 1890 or so. This view here was probably taken from one of the directors' cottages. Looking south along the mill pond, you can see a passenger car parked on one of those sidings to the right, and you can see one of the sidings that allows for the dumping of logs. You can also see to the left several of the workers' cottages down here. So they were right there. They got a good view, but they were also visible. And so because they were so visible, and Southern Pacific did still want to do some tourism in this area, they made sure that all the houses were whitewashed. A lot of them had little gardens in front, and they were generally well maintained, at least all the ones that were visible from the railroad tracks. Here's just kind of a opposite view, probably taken from a little bit further north, so you can see a bunch of logs on those flat cars to the right, and the mill off in the distance. And then this is a picture of the town itself. One of the things I love about this photo is if you look right above the saloon, there is a stuffed black cougar up there, which is pretty cool. I don't know the whole story of that cougar. That'd be a fun story to find out the whole history of, but it was kept up there for several years. And then there's a water tower in the background that supplied all the water for the trains. And then over to the right, this is the Loma Prieta station for the Southern Pacific Railroad. Next to him, you have this really small hotel next to the saloon. So this clearly wasn't the main hotel that Southern Pacific wanted. This must have just been for passersby. And we don't actually know a whole lot about that. We just know it doesn't match any of the descriptions of the main hotel in Loma Prieta. So it just must have been some smaller hostelry for worker families that were maybe visiting. Here's just a little bit different angle of the town looking from the north-south. And that's a full Southern Pacific passenger train there, but I think that's 80 right next to it since it's got that saddleback. There's some worker cottages. This one was taken later after the town was mostly abandoned, but some workers still live there. They mostly did split stuff operations in the little gulches and canyons that couldn't be harvested otherwise. That's pretty much the same houses from a different angle looking north from the mill pond. This is later on, so you can see that the hills are much sparser with their timber. A lot more has been cut out. And then this is the Porter house. Actually, sorry, this is the Bishop house probably with this family. Surprisingly, I don't actually have a great photo of the Porter house. It looks like a bunch of people have instruments. They're just having a good time out in the woods, looking out over the railroad grade and the mill pond. Yeah, this is the best one I have of the Porter house. So you see the windmill there. These are nice little houses up in the woods. And so these were both directors of the Loma Prieta lumber company. And so they just lived there. The Porter family oversaw many of the daily operations there. So they were kind of the directors on site. So if anybody had like complaints or issues or anything major happens, you could go talk to Warren Porter. And then this is the only good photo I could find. If you look far in the distance, this little house here, or this little structure here, is probably one of those hotels that I was mentioning. And then there seems to be two other buildings over here to the right that also may be some of those hotels. So it's this complex in the woods. We're not quite sure what it entailed, but there were buildings that seemed to match the descriptions. They just were not photographed heavily. All right, so moving on. Now that we've got the mill established, and this one's not going to burn down, so that's good. The next thing to do is they need to continue the main route. So the railroad had originally pledged 5 miles along the route, but they later revised that to 7.08 miles, which would bring it to a fork in Aptos Creek, which separated it between the east and west branches. It was also marked the bottom of what would later be called Bassett Gulch. So with the mill moved and everything and they didn't want to do a whole lot of logging in that area right away because, again, that desire to have some tourist traffic, what they decided to do is just continue building the track. So you can see at the bottom here, you can see the original route of the railroad right about where that spur ends. At the bottom left is where Monte Vista ended. And so everything beyond that is new track. And so this track was built was completed March 14th, 1888. It was very difficult to get through because this section here called Hell's Gate got that nickname because look at all of those little trestles. All those little black boxes you see on the route there, those are railroad trestles that cover all these tiny little gulches and gullies. It was so steep that they just had to keep bridging it. And so it was a huge mess. When they finally got out of it and got on the other side of Hell's Gate Gulch, it was a great thing for them because it was pretty much a clear shot from there. Today, you would not have the impression it's a clear shot because it seems so overgrown, and you have this thing that Powell called the big slide area, which completely destroys your visual idea of what this area was. But at the time, it was actually a relatively even route to get there. And so once you get past Hell's Gate, you follow the route. It stayed on the west bank of Aptos Creek the entire time until just before it went into Monte Vista, right at the end there. Monte Vista was at 6.4 mile marker. And so here's some of this is probably either a construction crew or maybe checking for damage from a small flood. Yet there are some people posing in it, so I'm not entirely sure what this is really depicting, but it seems to be about 1886. That's definitely along that route of that section of the railroad. This one just shows a train with some logs going. Once again, there's our friend Jupiter hauling the logs. They also have a passenger car. It looks like a flat car with a bunch of passengers on it. And it would be So it's pushing the train down the hill, and then it will dump them into the pond once they get there. Hopefully not dumping the passengers as well. And then this is the actual town. There's not tons of photos that show Monte Vista 2. They weren't very creative, so they just called the new place Monte Vista 2, even though it was no longer the main mill. There was a shingle mill there, and it probably had limited capacity to do some lumber, but its main focus was really as a collection ground. And so if you look closely in the foreground, you can see next to this, kind of between the water tower and the first buildings to the right, you can see what's a loading area. It's a transloading area for oxen and steam donkey driven logs to be transferred onto flat cars. And you can see on the right, you can see a skid road going down to it from the other side. You can see a couple workers' cabins hidden up in the hills too. And then the tracks themselves go right down the middle. And so it's a small little operation here. They had another water tower. The whole goal of this was to bring logs up from the upper end of Aptos Creek down to the mill. And so here's some oxen, as I mentioned, just hanging out in Monte Vista number 2. I'm not even sure, probably waiting to be arranged so they can go back up into the hills. This would be just, this would probably be the transloading station, actually. You can see logs falling on the hill in the background, and you can see that little loading platform to the right of the train. There's some guys chilling on flat cars that are full of logs, waiting for the train to leave. And this is just a nice photo of a lot of the lumber crews. And so there'll be all sorts of people doing all sorts of things, which explains why we don't actually get too many photos of lumber crews together like this. They probably only took these every couple of years, and usually when there was some big achievement. So this may have been when the Loma Prieta Lumber Company beat the Valencia Mill in lumber production, because Valencia Mill did the same thing. So this could be one of those photos just kind of celebrating such a cool accomplishment. So this is where things get a lot more sketchy. Historians, at least according to Powell, historians have actually questioned if the railroad actually went further than Monte Vista. The photos we have do show the line continuing beyond it, and there are some photos that seem to suggest that they went beyond it. The issue is there's almost no evidence, partially because of the floods and partially because we can't really get up there in the same way. That the big slide has really damaged the ability to access any of the old right-of-way beyond the slide area. And even when you get past there, it's just so overgrown that all the trails, none of them are maintained anymore. So what seems to be a case, though, is that the railroad wrapped around Five Finger Falls, continued up Aptos Creek, sometimes going right down the center of it even, possibly on extended trestles, where it then the line itself ended just at the 1,000-foot elevation point, which is where the branches split. And then from this point, they had a little landing, which may have been one of those photos I just showed you. It's unclear. They had a little landing, and that's where they got all of their lumber. And the lumber would have been brought down almost exclusively by steam donkeys, possibly using skylines, which were steam donkeys that were anchored in certain places, and the logs were lowered down from the air. And it seems like something crazy today, but they were totally doing that even in the mid-1880s. So, and by this point, we're talking about the 1890s, really. And so the railroad that was the end of track for the railroad, and that's how far north the locomotives would go. The track itself extended a little bit further up to the 1,200 elevation point, but from that point, it was probably just horses and mules that would have taken the train up to that point, and then gravity, which would have brought it back down. And so, and again, the evidence for that, it's in the newspapers, it's in other sources, but a lot of this direct evidence is actually gone now because the San Francisco earthquake in 1906 destroyed so many of this Southern Pacific Railroad's records. This is probably the transloading facility that was at the Forks. It doesn't quite match the other photos that I have of oxen loading facilities. There were some oxen that were used initially, so this could be early on. It's just not super clear, but it seems to show that kind of, even if it's not that exact one, this is showing you what kind of relationship would have been happening up in this area. So that's the end of the line. That last extension was probably opened around June 1890. and it ran only for a couple years, until about 1893. And here's a nice picture of Five Finger Falls from about 1890. There were only 6 official stops ever on the Loma Prieta branch, ones that were recognized by Southern Pacific, that is. Ready, which was set up many, many years later to harvest timber near the southern end of the Augmentation. Actually, it was south of the border for the Augmentation. It was actually in Rancho, Aptos, and that was for one of Frederick Keene's children, I believe, Ruth Reddy. There was Molino, Loma Prieta, which was the village, not the mill. The mill didn't actually have its own official stop until Molino was established. And Molino Station was actually officially established only in the 1910s. So it gives you a little taste of the timeline here. Loma Prieta town had a stop. Loma Prieta mill, when it was moved, actually was considered a freight stop. And then you have Spring Creek, which I explained was a strange stop that was actually marked as one in records. And then the 2 Monte Vistas, it just kept the same name and just moved. So the full length of the operating line was 7.08 miles. Bassett Gulch Extension gave it another 3.6 miles. But no trains ran on that, just flat cars. And just to sum up a couple of the little things, there were several other small spurs that were built after the end of the line was reached, and they finished logging the upper part of Aptos Creek. So they had a couple operations. They had a second operation on Spring Creek. They later would have a third one once they no longer needed the spring. They had an operation that was one of the more ambitious ones that went into what's today's big slide area, but back then wasn't a slide area. And that actually had a track go all the way south along the east bank of Aptos Creek from Monte Vista 2. It crossed over the mainline tracks at a higher elevation and then did a switchback within the big slide area. Powell was fortunate enough to be able to explore that before the floods damaged it all. And then further south, there was a spur that went up Love Gulch, one that went up Bridge Creek. The Bridge Creek one that's there today, the one that's well known, that actually was from a later time. That was from the late 1910s. So this one probably was partially repurposed for that. So it's unclear where the actual right-of-way is for it, but we know that there was a spur on Bridge Creek as early as about 1895. One just final note is that they actually had planned to build a tunnel into the Hinckley Gulch region. They were going to extend it all the way from the 1,000 elevation point, and they were going to cut it straight to 1,000 elevation point in Hinckley Creek. It would have been the longest railroad tunnel in the county, longer than the Summit Tunnel, and it would have been exclusively for accessing timber. It would have been set 1.75 miles long, and after a storm in 1899 severely damaged the Loma Prieta branch, they did repair it, contrary to belief, but the problem was it cost a lot to repair it, and they realized they really didn't want to put a bunch more money into the tunnel when the tunnel would probably need repairs in the future. The Loma Prieta branch was going to need constant repairs, and they determined it just wasn't going to be worth it. So Loma Prieta Lumber Company eventually decided they just have to harvest it some other way, and that was after the period of this talk. But just know they did plan a tunnel there. I told you the line was damaged in March 1899. Passenger service ended that November, and then in 1902 around, the tracks were cut back to the Monte Vista 1 site. So after that point, nothing went past about 5 miles. They were cut back even more to about 4 miles in 1907. The depot was finally moved from across Aptos Creek in 1910 to just near the old compound. The next year, they were cut back to Bridge Creek to 3.7 miles, and most of the remaining spurs and sidings were moved. And then we fast forward, January 31st, 1926, the railroad operations officially ended. The line was abandoned sometime in 1928, and then the tracks themselves were removed in 1936. And I have a couple photos just showing today. Some of these you probably will have seen, but here's a bridge over the 4th crossing. There's some ties that are still embedded in the path. It's the epicenter, which is right along the right-of-way. Little traces of the right-of-way, now mostly buried and overgrown. And then this is the slide area, which is really where your exploration will end if you try to explore the park for railroad signs. This is pretty much where you're going to have to end the story. And so that is where I will end the story, looking out at the big slide area and wishing I could walk further on without having to bushwhack through poison oak and a lack of trail. So thank you for that, everyone.